The snow had been falling since before midnight, the kind of heavy, wet Ontario snow that turned parking lots into lakes by morning and made the drive into downtown Toronto feel twice as long as it actually was. Inside Meridian Tower, on the 38th floor, where the lights never seemed to fully go out, only one person had been there since before the cleaning crew finished their shift. His name was Dominic Sabo, and he was pushing a maintenance cart slowly past the glass walls of the executive conference suite, one hand steady on the handle, the other wrapped around a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere around 2 in the morning. He moved the way people learn to move when they have spent years being invisible in important rooms. Quiet, efficient, eyes forward. His badge said facilities, and his uniform was the same faded navy blue he wore every shift, pressed each night before bed because his daughter had once told him he looked like a real professional in it, and he had never forgotten that. Dominic was 41 years old. His daughter, Rosie, was 9, and she was the reason he was here at 4 in the morning instead of home in their apartment in Scarborough, where the radiator clicked and hummed through the night, and she slept curled up on her side, with one arm around the stuffed bear she had named Gerald after a character in a book he used to read to her. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, something was coming apart. He could hear it before he could make sense of it. Voices stretched thin, a chair pushed back hard against marble. Through the sealed executive doors, the tension leaked into the corridor like smoke under a door, invisible but unmistakable. Meridian Capital Partners was one of the oldest private equity management firms in the country, built over 30 years by a woman named Harriet Vance, who had started with 2 borrowed computers and a shared office above a dry cleaner on King Street. The company that bore her name had survived 3 recessions, 2 leadership transitions, and 1 very public lawsuit that had ended in Harriet's favor. It was not supposed to die like this, but at 4:17 in the morning, the people inside that boardroom were watching it die in real time. Dominic kept moving. He sprayed the glass panel beside the elevator, wiped it clean in slow circles, and did not look directly into the room. That was rule 1. You did not stare at executives the way you did not stare at someone crying in a coffee shop. You gave them the dignity of invisibility because that was the only currency maintenance staff were ever offered in return. He noticed the document before he understood what it was. It had slid from the edge of the conference table and come to rest against the doorframe, caught in the gap between the door and the threshold. A single printed sheet, face up. An assistant had rushed past it without stopping. A senior partner had stepped over it without looking down. Dominic would have left it alone, except that the number at the bottom of the visible column caught him the way a wrong note catches a musician. Not a mistake he could name immediately. Just a wrongness that registered before thought arrived. He bent slightly, the way you do when you are not sure you are allowed to look at something, and looked anyway. Inside the boardroom, Helena Vance, Harriet's daughter, the CEO who had spent 12 years learning every floor of this company from the inside out, was holding a pen above the final page of a creditor protection filing. Her hand was steady. Her face was composed. Everything about her posture said she had accepted what she was about to do. The CFO, a man named Rowan Chesley, had his hands flat on the table. The outside legal team sat along the far wall with the particular stillness of people being paid by the hour to witness something terrible. 3 institutional investors had pulled out of an emergency recapitalization call 2 hours ago. The firm's largest credit facility had triggered a technical default in September. The board had voted 6-2 to proceed with protection filing. The documents were prepared. The pen was in Helena's hand. Outside the door, Dominic Sabo looked at the number on the page for the 3rd time. And then he did something that went against every instinct 8 years of facilities work had built into him. He pushed the boardroom door open. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when something impossible occurs in an expensive room. 10 people turned toward the door and found a maintenance worker standing in the frame, one gloved hand still on the handle, a cleaning cloth tucked into his belt, his expression caught between certainty and terror. Every person in that room had the same expression, the slight recalibration that happens when the furniture speaks. Helena's pen remained above the page. Rowan Chesley recovered first. His voice came out sharply, the reflexive authority of someone whose status had never been questioned by anyone wearing a facilities badge. This floor is restricted during executive session. He looked toward the assistant near the wall. Who cleared this? Dominic did not step back. His pulse was loud in his own ears. He had stood in enough rooms where he did not belong to know that hesitation looked worse than confidence, and he had spent enough years doing math in his head to know that what he had seen on that page was not a rounding difference. Helena spoke before he could calculate whether to speak. What is it? Not a question. The voice of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and had run out of patience for anything that was not essential. Dominic cleared his throat once. The amortization schedule on the subordinated debt facility, he said. Page 3, I think. The residual carrying value doesn't match what the covenant trigger calculation is based on. It's about 4 years off. Rowan's expression moved through disbelief and landed somewhere closer to contempt. You read covenant calculations. The number just looked wrong. You mop floors. Yes, Dominic said. But that covenant trigger threshold isn't right if the original facility vintage is 2019. The carrying value should be lower by now, which means the default calculation might not hold. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Helena lowered the pen to the table without signing and looked at the sheet Dominic was indicating, still half visible near the door. Bring that here, she said. Rowan leaned forward. Helena, we're 40 minutes past the filing window. Creditors are. Bring it here, she said again. Quieter, more dangerous. One of the junior analysts, a young woman named Preethi Sunderland, who had been awake since the previous morning and was running entirely on vending machine coffee and professional terror, picked up the page and carried it to Helena. Then she pulled her laptop closer and began working without being asked because she was the kind of person who understood when the room had shifted and moved before anyone said to. Helena read the sheet, then she read it again. Show me the full amortization table, she said. Preethi turned the screen. The room waited. What happened next took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Preethi cross-referenced 3 documents, pulled 2 archived schedules from the shared drive, and found what Dominic had seen the edge of from the corridor. The covenant trigger calculation had been built using the original principal balance of the subordinated facility rather than the amortized carrying value. 4 years of scheduled principal repayments had been paid and recorded correctly in the Treasury system, but the covenant model had never updated. It was still measuring default against a balance that no longer existed. The firm was not in technical default. It had never triggered the covenant. Preethi said it carefully. The way you say something when you are not entirely sure you are allowed to say it. If this is right, the default notice is based on an incorrect baseline. Rowan was on his feet. Models drift during restructuring. This is a documentation issue, not. How much? Helena asked, looking at Preethi. The actual carrying value is about 31 million lower than what the covenant calculation uses. Preethi pulled a second screen, which changes the leverage ratio by, she typed. Her hands had stopped shaking. The trigger threshold isn't breached, not on the current figures. The legal team along the wall exchanged a look that Helena noticed and filed. She turned back toward the door. Dominic was still standing there, not because he had decided to stay, but because he had not been able to make himself leave once the room had started moving. What's your name? Helena asked. Dominic Sabo. How long have you been with the building? 7 years. Rowan cut in from across the table, voice stripped of pretenses now. He cannot be in this room during a confidential executive session. Whatever he saw, whatever he thinks Rowan. Helena's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Sit down. He sat. Helena looked at Dominic steadily. You said the vintage. You knew the facility started in 2019. Dominic hesitated. I've cleaned this floor for 7 years. You hear things. That's not what I mean, and you know it. She tilted her head slightly. What did you do before this? The question was quiet but exact, and Dominic felt it land the way certain questions do when they arrive at the part of a conversation you have been managing around for years. Before this, I did a lot of things, he said. Helena waited. I worked in structured finance, he said finally. Corporate credit, mostly. I was at a firm in Calgary for 5 years before. He stopped, before things changed. Nobody in the room spoke. Preethi had stopped typing. My wife got sick, Dominic said. Not a little sick, the kind where everything else becomes a logistics problem. We moved to Toronto because the specialist program was here. She was sick for 2 years and then she died. And I had Rosie, who was 2 years old, and I had a mortgage. And I had about 4 weeks before the industry I'd worked in decided that a 2-year employment gap made me a liability risk. He did not say this with anger. He said it the way you describe weather. Facilities management paid while I figured things out. And then it kept paying while Rosie grew up, because the hours let me drop her at school myself and pick her up myself and be the parent who was actually there, which turned out to matter more than the title. The room was entirely still. Rowan had his hands folded on the table. His expression had changed into something that had no name in boardroom language. Helena looked at him for a long moment before she looked back at Dominic. The page you found. Was that the only thing? Dominic had been thinking about this since the room started moving. He had not wanted to say what came next, but he had come this far. The default notice would have accelerated the term loan, he said, which would have cross-triggered the revolving facility. Helena nodded slowly. Yes. But if the covenant calculation is wrong, the default notice itself might be defective. He paused, which means the acceleration might not be valid. The legal team along the wall was already opening laptops. Helena picked up her phone and called someone whose number she clearly had memorized. When the call connected, she said simply, "Don't file, we need an hour." Rowan opened his mouth. "I said sit down," Helena said without looking at him. He sat again. What followed was the kind of work that happens when very good people realize they have been handed back time they thought was gone. The legal team pulled the original credit agreement. Preethi rebuilt the covenant calculation from scratch. A second analyst, a quiet man named Frederick Nwachukwu, who had joined 3 months ago from a bank in Montreal, found another linked discrepancy in the interest reserve model that had been calculated on the wrong base. The picture that emerged over the next 90 minutes was not a saved company. It was not a victory. It was something more complicated than both, a firm that had been sicker than it admitted to itself, being shown that the illness was not as far advanced as someone had allowed it to believe. Dominic stayed near the wall because Helena had not told him to leave, and because Preethi kept glancing at him when a calculation needed a second set of eyes, and because somewhere around 6 in the morning he realized that leaving felt wrong in the same way ignoring the page had felt wrong. At 6:45, Helena looked up from the revised model. "The acceleration is defective," the lead legal counsel said. Her name was Constance Fairweather, and she had been practicing restructuring law in Toronto for 24 years, and she said the sentence with the careful restraint of someone who understood what it meant. If the covenant trigger is invalid, the default notice doesn't hold. The lenders will dispute it. This becomes a negotiation, not a filing. How long do we have? To respond formally? 72 hours if we serve notice of dispute by noon today. Helena exhaled once. Short. She looked toward the window. Outside, Toronto was going gray with early morning, the snow still falling, office towers emerging from the dark as streetlights began cutting out one by one. Then she looked toward Dominic Sabo, who was standing near the wall with his cleaning cloth still tucked into his belt and his thermos on the floor beside his cart, and she looked at him the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand what exactly just happened. "You could have walked past that page," she said. Dominic considered that. "It didn't look right," he said. "I didn't know what I was going to do when I walked in. I just knew I couldn't walk past it. Why not?" He thought about Rosie asleep in the apartment in Scarborough, her arm around Gerald the stuffed bear, the radiator clicking. He thought about the morning 2 weeks ago when she had asked him if the people who worked upstairs ever got sad, and he had told her that everyone got sad sometimes, and she had looked at him with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old and said, "But does someone help them?" "Because 4,000 people work in this building," Dominic said. "And not all of them are on the 38th floor. Helena held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the table. "Constance, draft the dispute notice. Frederick, I need the full interest reserve restatement by 9. Preethi, rebuild the leverage analysis with the corrected vintage figures and have it ready for the lender call." She paused. "And someone get Mr. Sabo a proper cup of coffee." Preethi smiled for the first time in what felt like 2 days. She went to the credenza herself. Rowan Chesley had not spoken in 40 minutes. When he finally did, his voice had lost the smooth authority it usually carried. "This doesn't resolve the underlying liquidity position," he said. "We've bought time. That's all." Helena looked at him evenly. "We didn't buy time, Rowan. Someone handed us time we had already written off." She turned back to the documents. "And we're going to be very careful about how we account for that in the next conversation." Rowan's jaw tightened. He said nothing else. By 8 in the morning, 3 things had become clear to everyone in the room except Rowan Chesley, who was still working through the mathematics of what had happened to his position. The first was that the covenant trigger had been miscalculated by someone who either did not understand the amortization schedule or had reasons to prefer that no one looked at it carefully. The second was that Rowan had presented the default analysis personally and had signed off on the covenant calculation as part of his CFO certification. The third was that Rowan had a meeting scheduled for 9:30 with a representative from the lending syndicate, which was the sort of meeting a CFO would not typically schedule for the morning of a creditor protection filing unless he already knew something about what came next. Frederick found the meeting in the shared calendar while he was rebuilding the interest reserve model. He mentioned it quietly to Preethi, who mentioned it quietly to Constance, who walked it directly to Helena without saying anything to anyone else. Helena read the calendar entry twice. Then she pulled the document trail for the covenant calculation and looked at the version history. Dominic noticed the quality of her silence change. It was the second kind of silence he had learned to recognize in important rooms, not the silence of people absorbing information, but the silence of someone assembling a different kind of picture than the one they started with. "How many revisions does this model have?" Helena asked, still looking at her screen. Frederick checked. 11 versions over 4 months. Show me the change log." A pause. "Then, most of the formula changes are in versions 4 through 7. "Who made them?" Frederick hesitated. "The credentials show CFO approval on all the substantive edits." The room absorbed this. Rowan stood up from his chair. His voice came out measured and managed, the tone of someone who had prepared for this possibility and had decided confidence was the most efficient defense. "Models evolve during a restructuring process. You're looking at working documents." Helena did not look at him. "Sit down, Rowan." "Helena, this is a fishing expedition based on sit down." She turned toward him now, and the expression on her face was not anger. It was something quieter and more complete. "Or don't. But if you leave this room before Constance has finished, we're going to proceed on the assumption that you had reasons to leave." He sat. Helena's general counsel arrived at 8:15, followed by 2 members of the board she had called before the sun was fully up. The meeting at 9:30 with the lending syndicate representative was cancelled. A different meeting was arranged instead, one that included the firm's outside auditors and a law partner from a firm that specialized in a different area of practice than restructuring. Nobody on the 38th floor fully understood what was happening below that level, but by 9 o'clock the building had the particular atmosphere of a place where large things were shifting behind surfaces. Assistants moved faster than usual. The coffee in the third-floor kitchen ran out twice before noon. The elevator indicators showed a lot of movement between the executive floor and legal. Dominic had been told he could go. He had started toward the door twice and stopped both times because Preeti kept saying his name and the model kept throwing discrepancies that he could see before she finished explaining them. He was thinking about Rosie's school pickup when Helena appeared beside him at the window. "She'll be fine," Helena said, following his glance at the clock. Dominic looked at her. "My assistant called the school at 6. Advised them you might be delayed. She left a number for the office." Helena's expression was not warm exactly, but it was direct, and directness, Dominic had learned, was its own form of respect. They were very understanding. Dominic did not say anything for a moment. "That wasn't necessary," he said. "No," Helena agreed. It also wasn't a big decision. She looked out at the city, which was beginning to emerge into a pale, thin morning, the snow slowing to something lighter, almost hesitant. The way snow moves when it is deciding whether to stop. "You said structured finance," she said. "Calgary. Hammond Burn Capital," Dominic said. "Credit Structuring Group." Helena nodded once, recognizing the name. "And you chose facilities management over going back." "I chose Rosie over going back," he said. "It came out flat. Not bitter, just accurate. I missed 2 parent-teacher interviews and 1 Christmas concert and 1 specialist appointment in my first year of trying to do both. By the 4th missed thing, she had stopped telling me about the next ones in advance." A pause. "Kids adapt. That's the thing people don't tell you. They get efficient about disappointment. And one day you realize your daughter has stopped assuming you'll be there, and that's the thing you can't undo." Helena was quiet. "So I made a choice," he said. "And the choice was good. Is it still good?" Dominic looked at her. "Every morning I drop her at school, and every afternoon I pick her up and she tells me everything that happened. Every single thing. Because she still expects me to be there." He looked back at the city. "Yes, it's still good." Helena picked up her coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. "Then I have a problem," she said. He waited. "We have a financial systems review that's going to take approximately 4 months and require someone who can read across the intersection of credit modeling and treasury operations without being coached on either." She set the cup down. "And I'm looking at someone who did exactly that in under 12 minutes at 4:30 in the morning, and who has told me he made a deliberate choice to prioritize availability over income." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "I drop her at 8 and I pick her up at 3:30. Then you would leave at 3:15. And if she's sick, I leave immediately. Then you leave immediately. The role doesn't come at the expense of the reason I took the other one." Helena looked at him steadily. "I understand what I'm asking. I don't think you do yet." He said it without aggression. "Just evenly, because there's more than Rosie. There are 11 part-time facilities staff in this building who are working split shifts because the building management company reclassified their positions during the pandemic and never reclassified them back. They're not eligible for benefits at those hours. 3 of them have kids. 1 of them is 62 and commuting from Brampton." He paused. "If I step into a different role in this building, I want that reviewed. Formally. before I start. Helena held his gaze for a long time. That's a significant ask, she said. It's the only one. Another long pause. Done, she said. Dominic looked at the city. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely. The kind of sudden quiet that follows a long storm when the air goes still and everything looks briefly new before the traffic and the salt trucks and the ordinary weight of the day comes back in. He thought about what he would tell Rosie when he picked her up that afternoon. He thought about how he would describe a day that had started before the sun and ended with something he had not expected. He thought about what she had asked him 2 weeks ago, about whether the people upstairs ever got sad and whether someone helped them. He thought, yes, sometimes someone does. The final board meeting of the day began at 2 in the afternoon and ended before 4. The corrected covenant analysis was presented to the full board and to counsel for the lending syndicate, who had arrived with a very different set of assumptions and a one-sided expression that did not survive the first 30 minutes of the presentation. The default notice was disputed formally before noon. The acceleration was challenged on the basis of the covenant miscalculation. The Lenders' Council asked for a recess that stretched into 45 minutes of quiet conversation in a side room. Rowan Chesley was not present for any of it. He had spent the morning in a conference room on the 34th floor with the firm's general counsel, and 2 people from an external firm whose area of practice nobody needed to announce. What emerged from the board session was not a rescue. It was a reprieve and a conditional one. The firm had 30 days to present a restated covenant analysis to the syndicate, time to negotiate a waiver, time to address the underlying financial structure with something closer to the true picture. It was not safety. But it was not the end either, and that morning at 4:30 it had seemed like the end was about 40 minutes away. One of the board members, a woman who had served with Harriet Vance in the firm's first decade, stopped Dominic in the corridor on her way out. She was perhaps 70 years old and moved like someone accustomed to being in the last room when difficult things were decided. "You're Sabo?" she said. "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Harriet had a saying," she said, "about this firm. She used to say the building knows things the boardroom doesn't. I always thought it was nostalgia." She gave him a look that was not sentimental at all, apparently not. Then she walked to the elevator without elaborating, the way people do when they have said exactly what they meant and do not require confirmation. Dominic retrieved his cart from beside the service corridor and stood with it for a moment outside the now empty boardroom. The long table was covered in printed pages and open laptops and empty coffee cups, the aftermath of a day that had gone in a direction nobody on that floor had been expecting when they arrived. Through the glass wall, the city had gone from gray snow morning to gold afternoon, the sun low and flat across the skyline the way it gets in late autumn in Toronto, when every building catches it differently and the whole downtown looks briefly like something that was built to last. He had one thought before he started moving, which was not a profound thought and would not have impressed anyone in the boardroom if he had said it aloud. It was just, "I hope Rosie had a good day." He picked up Rosie at 3:38, 8 minutes later than usual. She was standing outside the school's side entrance with her backpack on and her mittens already lost, which happened about twice a week, regardless of how many pairs he bought. She looked up when she saw him and did not wave because she was 9 and had decided waving was for smaller children, but she walked toward him slightly faster than she would have walked toward anything else. "You're late," she said. "Big day at work," he said. "Did something break?" Dominic considered how to answer that. "Something was wrong," he said, "and then we fixed it." Rosie accepted this the way she accepted most explanations about adult work, which was to say she filed it without further inquiry and moved directly to what she actually wanted to talk about. "We did a project on ecosystems," she said. "I did mine on boreal forests because you said we live near one and I wanted to know if that was true." "We live near the edge of one," he said. "Technically. That still counts," she said firmly. "Yes," he agreed. "That counts." They walked to the car through the pale afternoon. The streets were wet with melted snow, the puddles catching the last of the low sun and sending it back in pieces. Rosie talked about boreal forests for 4 blocks, and then about a disagreement she had with a classmate over whether wolves were social or territorial, and then, in the way that children transition without warning, she stopped mid-sentence and looked up at him. "Are you tired?" she asked. "A little," he said. She took his hand without commenting on it, the way she sometimes did when she decided something without announcing the decision, and they walked the last block to the car that way. He was tired. He was tired in the particular way of a day that had asked more than a regular day asks, the kind of tired that comes not from doing too much but from being fully present through something large. The kind of tired, he thought, that you can sleep off cleanly. That night, after Rosie was asleep with Gerald the stuffed bear under one arm and a library book face down on the pillow beside her, Dominic sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the folder Helena's assistant had sent him before 5, unopened. He sat with it for a few minutes before he opened it. Inside was a letter of offer on Meridian Capital Partners letterhead. The title read Senior Advisor, Financial Systems Integrity. The hours were flexible. The start date was 2 weeks out. There was a line near the bottom, handwritten in Helena's own handwriting rather than printed, which said, "The reclassification review begins Monday regardless. You had nothing to do with that." He sat with the folder for a while longer. Then he closed it and carried his coffee to the window. Outside, Scarborough was quiet the way it gets after a long snowfall, the streets clean and still, orange light pooling under the lamps. A few windows still lit in the buildings across the lot. Someone's dog moving slowly along the far sidewalk, nose down, reading the night. Dominic Sabo stood at the window and drank his coffee and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing he rarely got to do, and which turned out in that moment to be exactly enough.